The text message arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday while I was helping my mom navigate the stairs with her walker. My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter as I steadied her elbow, and something about the timing made my stomach clench before I even looked at the screen. David's message was short, almost casual in its cruelty. Sold the Civic today. Got a great price. We'll explain when you get back. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I stared at those words until they blurred, my grip tightening on Mom's arm as the full weight of what he'd done crashed over me. My car. My midnight blue 2019 Honda Civic that I'd bought with Grandma Rose's inheritance money. The first major purchase I'd ever made entirely on my own, without consulting anyone, without asking permission, without compromise. He'd sold it while I was 2 hours away taking care of my mother who could barely walk to the bathroom alone. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and if you'd asked me a year ago to describe my life, I would have painted you a picture of quiet contentment. I was 32, worked as a marketing coordinator for Henderson Marketing Group in Riverside, California, and lived in a modest 3-bedroom house with my husband David and our golden retriever Buddy. I drove my Honda Civic to work every morning, stopped at the same coffee shop for a vanilla latte, and felt grateful for the simple stability of routine. I thought I understood the boundaries of my world, the shape of my marriage, the limits of what I was willing to tolerate in the name of love and partnership. I was wrong about all of it. Standing in my mother's kitchen that Tuesday night, holding her phone while she gripped her walker with white knuckles, I realized that the woman I'd been for the past 6 years was about to die. The woman who said yes when she meant no, who swallowed her anger to keep the peace, who convinced herself that sacrifice was love and silence was strength. That woman had just received her death notice in the form of a text message, and what rose from her ashes would be something David Mitchell had never encountered before. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how a marriage can end with a single text message about a car sale, you need to understand how I became the kind of woman whose husband thought he could sell her most precious possession without consequence. You need to understand the slow erosion of boundaries, the gradual redefinition of partnership, and the way love can become a weapon when wielded by someone who mistakes kindness for weakness. It started the way these stories always start, with small compromises that seemed reasonable at the time. David and I met 7 years ago at a networking event for local businesses. I was there representing Henderson Marketing, trying to drum up new clients for our small but growing firm. He was there as a newly licensed real estate agent, all nervous energy and ambitious plans, wearing a suit that was just slightly too big for his lean frame. He had this way of listening that made you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room, leaning in just a little too close, asking follow-up questions that showed he was actually paying attention. We talked for 2 hours that night about everything except business. He told me about his dream of building a real estate empire, starting with residential sales and eventually moving into commercial properties and development. I told him about my love for graphic design, how I had studied art in college but ended up in marketing, because it felt more practical, more stable. There was something magnetic about his confidence, the way he talked about the future like it was a puzzle he'd already solved. Our first date was dinner at a small Italian restaurant downtown, and I remember being impressed by how he treated the waitstaff, how he seemed genuinely interested in my work stories, how he made me laugh until my cheeks hurt. He was different from the guys I'd dated before. More focused, more driven. While my ex-boyfriends had been content to drift through their 20s without much direction, David had 5-year plans and vision boards, and this unshakable belief that success was just a matter of working hard enough and wanting it badly enough. Looking back, I think I fell in love with his certainty as much as anything else. In a world that felt increasingly uncertain, David seemed to know exactly where he was going and how he was going to get there. Being with him felt like stepping into a stronger current, being pulled along by someone who had all the answers I'd been looking for. We moved in together after 8 months, married after 2 years, and bought our house in Riverside 6 months later. David's real estate career was taking off, and I was doing well at Henderson, designing marketing campaigns for small businesses and nonprofit organizations. We had separate bank accounts but shared expenses, separate friend groups but overlapping social lives. I thought we had the perfect modern marriage, built on mutual respect and individual autonomy. The changes started so subtly that I didn't notice them at first. It began with David asking for my help with a client presentation. He needed some marketing materials designed for a luxury listing, just a simple flyer and maybe a social media post. His usual designer was booked, and he was in a bind. Could I help him out? Just this once. It would only take a few hours, and he'd pay me back by cooking dinner for a week. I said yes because it seemed like such a small thing, and because I wanted to support his growing business. I stayed up until midnight that Tuesday, crafting an elegant brochure that showcased the property's best features, choosing fonts and colors that suggested sophistication without being flashy. David was thrilled with the result. The listing sold within a week, and he credited my marketing materials with helping to attract serious buyers. That's when he asked if I could design his business cards, then a logo for his growing client base, then a website. Each request came with gratitude and promises of reciprocation, and each time I said yes because it felt good to be needed, to have my skills appreciated in a way that my day job sometimes didn't provide. At Henderson, I was one of several designers working on accounts that rarely excited me. With David, I was the creative force behind something that was growing, something that mattered to someone I loved. The line between helping occasionally and working regularly blurred so gradually that I couldn't pinpoint when it disappeared entirely. By our third year of marriage, I was spending most of my evenings and weekends creating marketing materials for Mitchell & Associates Realty. Business cards, flyers, social media posts, website updates, email campaigns. David's client base had tripled, and he insisted it was largely due to the professional appearance I'd helped him cultivate. I told myself it was temporary, that once his business was fully established, we'd hire a proper marketing firm, and I could go back to having evenings and weekends to myself. I told myself it was an investment in our shared future, that David's success would benefit both of us. I told myself a lot of things to justify why I was essentially working 2 full-time jobs while David worked one. The first time I missed a deadline for one of my actual paying clients because I was finishing a rush project for David, I should have recognized it as a warning sign. Instead, I apologized profusely to my Henderson client, worked through the night to catch up, and promised myself I'd set better boundaries with David going forward. But boundaries, I was learning, were easier to set than to maintain, especially when the person crossing them was someone you lived with, slept next to, and loved. David had a way of making his needs seem more urgent than mine. When he had a listing presentation the next morning and needed marketing materials designed that evening, it felt selfish to prioritize my own work deadlines. When he landed a big client and needed a comprehensive marketing, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Package created over the weekend. It felt petty to insist on keeping my Saturday plans to visit my college roommate. His success felt like our success, and his emergencies became my emergencies, until I stopped having a clear sense of where his priorities ended and mine began. The money conversation started around our 4th year of marriage. David's business was booming, but he was also expanding rapidly, hiring assistant agents and investing in better office space and technology. Cash flow was tight, despite his growing success, and he started asking if I could cover more of our household expenses while he reinvested his earnings into the business. It made sense on paper. My salary from Henderson was steady and reliable, while his income fluctuated with market conditions and seasonal patterns. I could handle the mortgage and utilities and groceries, and he could focus on growing the business that would eventually support both of us. I said yes because it felt like being a good partner, like making a smart investment in our shared future. I said yes because David framed it as temporary, a short-term sacrifice that would pay dividends once his business was fully established. I said yes because I loved him and trusted him, and believed that marriages required compromise and mutual support. What I didn't realize was how quickly temporary arrangements become permanent expectations. What started as me covering a few extra bills while David got his business off the ground became me paying for everything while David reinvested every penny he earned into expansion and growth. I was subsidizing his dreams with my financial stability, and somehow I'd convinced myself that this was what love looked like. The car became a symbol of something I couldn't quite articulate at the time. Grandma Rose had passed away during our 5th year of marriage, leaving me a modest inheritance of $18,000. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was significant enough to represent possibilities. David immediately suggested we use it as a down payment on an investment property, something we could rent out for passive income, while the value appreciated. It was a smart financial move, he argued, much smarter than letting the money sit in a savings account earning minimal interest. But for the first time in years, I said no. I wanted that money to be mine, to represent something I'd chosen, rather than something we'd decided together. Grandma Rose had been a fiercely independent woman who'd run her own seamstress business until she was 75. She'd never owned a credit card, never owed anyone money, never asked permission to make her own decisions. Her inheritance felt like a final gift of autonomy, and I wanted to honor that by using it for something that was entirely my choice. I bought the Honda Civic on a sunny Saturday in March, walking into the dealership alone and paying with a cashier's check that represented my grandmother's final blessing. It was midnight blue with gray interior, reliable and practical but also beautiful in its simplicity. When I drove it off the lot, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The pure satisfaction of making a decision that pleased no one but myself. David was supportive, or at least he seemed to be. He admired the car's features, complimented my choice of color, even took photos of me with my new purchase. But I noticed how he suggested I should have gotten the extended warranty, how he questioned whether I'd negotiated the best possible price, how he mentioned that the money could have been earning returns in the real estate market instead of depreciating in my driveway. They were small comments, easily dismissed as caring concern, but they carried an undertone that made me defensive in a way I couldn't quite explain. That car became my sanctuary. During the 20-minute drive to work each morning, I could play my own music, think my own thoughts, exist in a space that was entirely mine. It was the only major possession I owned that didn't somehow relate to David's business or our shared life. When I ran errands on weekends, I found myself taking longer routes, savoring the feeling of being alone with my own thoughts and my own agenda. The car represented something I'd almost forgotten existed: the possibility of independence within marriage, the right to make decisions that served my own interests rather than our collective goals. By our 6th year of marriage, the pattern was firmly established. I worked 40 hours a week at Henderson Marketing, then came home to work another 20 hours a week on David's business materials. I paid all our household expenses while David reinvested his growing income into business expansion. I organized our social calendar around his networking events and client dinners. I'd become the supporting character in my own life, the reliable foundation that allowed David to take risks and chase opportunities. And then Mom fell. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March when she called, her voice shaky with pain and embarrassment. She'd been coming down the stairs with a basket of laundry when her knee gave out, sending her tumbling down the last 4 steps. The hospital confirmed what we'd both feared. She needed surgery to repair the damage, followed by weeks of physical therapy and recovery. She couldn't drive, could barely walk with assistance, and lived alone in the same Bakersfield house where I'd grown up. There was never any question that I would go help her. Mom had raised me alone after Dad left when I was 12, working double shifts as a nurse to keep us afloat, while never once making me feel like a burden or a sacrifice. She'd driven me to every soccer practice, attended every school play, celebrated every small victory, with the enthusiasm of someone who understood that love was measured in presence rather than presence. When she needed me, I would be there no matter what. David was understanding, or seemed to be. He agreed that Mom needed my help, that family came first, that he could manage without me for a week or so. He even offered to drive me to Bakersfield, though I declined because I knew he had important client meetings scheduled. I packed a week's worth of clothes, left detailed instructions for taking care of Buddy, and kissed David goodbye on a Monday morning, promising to call every day and come home as soon as Mom was stable. The drive to Mom's house in my Honda Civic felt like traveling backward through time. The familiar freeway landmarks, the gradual shift from suburban sprawl to agricultural valleys, the anticipation of entering the house where I'd learned to drive, graduated high school, and dreamed about my future. I'd made this trip dozens of times since moving to Riverside, but something about this journey felt different, more significant. Maybe it was the gravity of Mom's situation, or maybe it was the strange relief of having a week away from the constant demands of David's business and our increasingly complex marriage. Mom's injury was worse than she'd let on during our phone conversations. She could barely make it from her bedroom to the bathroom without assistance, and simple tasks like showering or preparing meals were completely beyond her capabilities. I spent the first 2 days helping her navigate basic daily activities, driving her to follow-up doctor's appointments, and organizing the home modifications she'd need for her recovery. It was exhausting work, both physically and emotionally, but it felt meaningful in a way that my usual routine didn't. On Tuesday evening, as I was helping Mom settle into bed after her physical therapy appointment, I felt genuinely useful for the first time in months. Not useful in the way that David's business needed me to be useful, but useful in the fundamental human sense of caring for someone who needed care. Mom was grateful for my help, but she was also proud of my competence, commenting on how organized I was, how thoughtful, how capable of handling whatever challenges arose. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone appreciate my abilities, without immediately asking for more. That's when David's text message arrived, shattering the peaceful bubble I'd been living in for 3 days. Sold the Civic today, got a great price, will explain when you get back. 11 words that changed everything, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted his right to make that decision. I read the message 3 times before the words penetrated. My car. My grandmother's inheritance. My symbol of independence and autonomy. Sold. While I was taking care of my mother. Without consultation, without warning, without consent. The audacity was breathtaking, but what struck me most was the assumption behind it. David had sold my car because he'd never really considered it mine. In his mind, we were married, so my possessions were our possessions, and our possessions were his to manage as he saw fit. The phone slipped from my trembling hands, clattering against the kitchen floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet house. Mom called out from her bedroom, asking if everything was okay, and I managed to call back that I'd just dropped something, that everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine. Everything was the opposite of fine. The man I'd married, the man I'd supported and sacrificed for and believed in, had just sold the most meaningful possession I owned while I was caring for my injured mother. I picked up the phone and called him immediately, my hands shaking as I waited for him to answer. When David's voice came through the speaker, cheerful and casual as if nothing earth-shattering had just occurred, I could barely speak. Sarah, hey, how's your mom doing? Getting stronger? You sold my car. The words came out flat, hollow, like someone else was speaking them through my mouth. Oh, you got my text. Yeah, crazy opportunity came up. Vanessa heard about this investment property that's going on the market tomorrow, cash offers only, and we needed to move fast. The Civic was just sitting in the driveway anyway, and I got $4,500 more than we paid for it. Market's crazy right now. Vanessa, his new business partner, a 29-year-old former model who'd gotten into real estate after her divorce settlement left her with enough capital to invest. She'd joined Mitchell & Associates 6 months ago, bringing her connections and investment capital in exchange for a partnership stake. David talked about her constantly, praising her business acumen, her market insights, her ability to close deals that other agents couldn't touch. I'd met her twice at office parties, where she'd looked through me like I was wallpaper while discussing expansion strategies with David. That wasn't your decision to make, I said, my voice still eerily calm despite the rage building in my chest. That was my car. I bought it with my grandmother's money. Come on, Sarah, we're married. It's not like I sold something that mattered. It's just a car. And besides, this investment is going to pay off huge. Vanessa thinks we can flip this property within 6 months and double our money. Your grandmother would have loved knowing her money was working that hard. Just a car. My inheritance, my independence, my one piece of financial autonomy reduced to just a car. The dismissal was so complete, so casually cruel, that I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. The woman who would have argued with him, who would have tried to explain why this mattered, who would have accepted his apology and found a way to forgive him, simply stopped existing. I have to go, I said. Mom needs her medication. Okay, but don't worry about the car thing. We'll figure out transportation when you get back. Maybe we can lease something, or you can ride with me to work until we decide what makes sense long term. I hung up without responding and stood in Mom's kitchen, staring at my reflection in the window above the sink. The woman looking back at me was someone I barely recognized, someone whose husband had just sold her most precious possession to fund a business venture with his attractive young partner. Someone whose marriage had apparently been a long con, designed to extract her labor, her money, and her autonomy until there was nothing left to take. Mom appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on her walker but moving with determination. She'd always been able to read my emotions, even when I tried to hide them, and the expression on her face told me she'd heard enough of my conversation to understand what had happened. "What did he do?" she asked, her voice carrying the protective edge that had gotten us through Dad's abandonment and every other crisis of my childhood. So I told her. I told her about the car, about the years of unpaid work, about the gradual erosion of my boundaries, and the slow disappearance of my identity. I told her about David's business expansion funded by my salary, about Vanessa's influence and David's increasing arrogance, about the way I'd become invisible in my own marriage. And as I talked, I watched my mother's face cycle through emotions I recognized from my own recent experiences: disbelief, anger, and finally, a cold determination that reminded me exactly whose daughter I was. "That's not a marriage," Mom said when I finished. "That's employment without benefits." She was right, of course. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being David's wife and become his unpaid employee, his financial support system, his convenient resource to be managed and deployed as needed. The car sale wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment. It was the logical conclusion of 6 years of increasing entitlement and decreasing respect. But what Mom said next surprised me, because it suggested she understood something about revenge that I was only beginning to grasp. "You know, honey, I still have Tom Rodriguez's business card. Remember Tom? He used to work with you at Henderson before he got that job with the state. Sweet man, went through that awful divorce a few years back. You were so kind to him during that whole mess." I did remember Tom. He'd been a senior account manager at Henderson for 3 years, a quiet, methodical man in his mid-40s who'd handled our most difficult clients with patient professionalism. When his wife left him for her personal trainer, Tom had fallen apart in ways that were painful to witness. He'd started making mistakes at work, missing deadlines, showing up looking like he'd slept in his car. While other colleagues avoided him or made awkward jokes about his situation, I'd brought him coffee during his worst days, listened when he needed to talk, and covered for him when his personal crisis interfered with his professional responsibilities. Tom had been grateful in a way that felt almost embarrassing at the time. He'd thanked me repeatedly for being kind when he felt like the rest of the world was treating him like a failure. When he left Henderson for a job with the state DMV, he'd made sure to give me his contact information, insisting that he owed me a favor and would help me with anything I ever needed. At the time, I'd thought it was just the kind of thing people say when they're feeling emotional. I'd never imagined there would come a day when I might actually need help from someone who worked in vehicle registration and fraud investigation. "Why do you still have his card?" I asked Mom, though something in her tone suggested she already knew where this conversation was heading. "Because I liked him. And because I've learned that in life you never know when you might need a friend who understands how systems work." Mom's smile was subtle but unmistakably mischievous. "Tom Rodriguez is a very thorough man, honey. Very committed to making sure all vehicle transactions are properly documented and legally sound." I stared at my mother, this woman who'd raised me to be polite and accommodating and fair, who was now suggesting something that felt distinctly like revenge. But as I thought about David's casual dismissal of my feelings, his assumption that my possessions were his to dispose of, his partnership with Vanessa funded by my inheritance money, I realized that Mom wasn't suggesting revenge at all. She was suggesting justice. "I should probably give Tom a call," I said slowly. "Just to catch up, see how he's doing." "That sounds lovely, dear. I'm sure he'd be delighted to hear from you." And for the first time since David's text message had arrived, I smiled. The call to Tom Rodriguez would have to wait until morning, but sleep was impossible that night. I lay in the guest room of my childhood home, staring at the ceiling fan that had been there since I was 16, listening to Mom's labored breathing from down the hall, and cataloging every moment that had led to David selling my car without permission. The memories came in waves, each one more damning than the last, painting a picture of a marriage that had died so slowly I hadn't noticed until the funeral was already over. I thought about the first time David had asked me to work late on one of his projects instead of attending my college roommate's birthday party. It was 3 years into our marriage, and his real estate business was finally gaining momentum after 2 difficult years of sporadic sales and financial stress. He'd landed a listing for a sprawling ranch property outside the city, complete with horse stables and a swimming pool, the kind of high-end property that could establish his reputation with affluent clients. The sellers were motivated but picky, he explained, and they'd specifically requested marketing materials that emphasized the property's luxury features without making it seem ostentatious. The birthday party was supposed to be a small gathering at Jessica's apartment. Nothing fancy, just a chance to catch up with friends I rarely saw anymore, since David's business had started consuming so much of our free time. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks, had even bought Jessica a beautiful scarf from the boutique downtown that I knew she'd love. But when David showed me the property photos and explained how much this listing could mean for his career, my own plans suddenly seemed selfish and frivolous. I canceled on Jessica with less than 2 hours' notice, claiming a work emergency that wasn't technically a lie, just not my work. I spent that Saturday evening hunched over my laptop, crafting marketing copy that would appeal to buyers who thought of horses as lifestyle accessories rather than livestock. David ordered Chinese takeout and brought me tea while I worked, praising my creativity and thanking me for understanding how important this was for our future. The listing sold within 3 weeks for above asking price, and David credited my marketing materials with attracting the serious offers that made the bidding war possible. Jessica never said anything about my last-minute cancellation, but something shifted in our friendship after that night. Our conversations became shorter, less frequent, weighted with the careful politeness of people who no longer quite trust each other. When she got engaged 6 months later, I wasn't invited to be a bridesmaid, even though we'd been planning each other's weddings since sophomore year of college. The exclusion stung, but I told myself it was natural for friendships to evolve as people entered different life stages. I didn't allow myself to consider that maybe Jessica had simply gotten tired of being the friend whose plans could be canceled whenever David's business needs took priority. The pattern established itself with ruthless efficiency after that first success. David would land a promising listing or attract a potential high-value client, and suddenly my evenings and weekends would disappear into a blur of logo designs, property descriptions, and social media content creation. I became fluent in real estate terminology, learned to photograph properties in ways that minimized flaws and emphasized potential, developed an instinct for the kind of aspirational language that made buyers fall in love with houses they couldn't quite afford. My own work at Henderson Marketing began to suffer in ways that were subtle but significant. I started missing networking events because I was working on David's projects. I turned down freelance opportunities that would have expanded my portfolio because I didn't have time to take on additional clients. My supervisor, Maria Santos, noticed the change during my annual review, gently suggesting that I seemed less engaged with my assigned accounts than I'd been in previous years. Maria was a sharp woman in her early 50s who'd built Henderson Marketing from a one-person operation into a respected regional firm. She had a reputation for being tough but fair, demanding excellence while supporting her employees' professional growth. When she asked if everything was okay at home, I assured her that I was simply going through a busy period and would refocus on my Henderson responsibilities. The lie came easily, smoothly, like I'd been practicing it without realizing. What I couldn't tell Maria was that my husband's business had become a second full-time job, one that paid nothing but demanded everything. David's requests for my help had evolved from occasional favors into standing expectations. He no longer asked if I could design something for him. He told me what he needed and when he needed it, with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been told no. When I mentioned feeling overwhelmed or suggested he hire a professional marketing firm, he'd remind me how much money we were saving by keeping the work in-house, how much better I understood his vision than any outsider could. The financial arrangements had shifted just as gradually and just as completely. What started as temporary assistance, while David reinvested his earnings, had become a permanent subsidy that funded not just his business expansion but his entire lifestyle. I paid the mortgage, the utilities, the groceries, the insurance premiums, the veterinarian bills for Buddy, the maintenance on both our vehicles. David covered his business expenses and his personal spending money, which seemed to increase along with his success, rather than contributing to our shared financial responsibilities. I justified this arrangement by telling myself it was an investment in our future prosperity. David's income was growing steadily, and once his business was fully established, we'd both benefit from the foundation I was helping him build. The logic seemed sound, even noble, like the kind of strategic partnership that successful couples created to maximize their combined potential. What I didn't acknowledge, even to myself, was how completely this arrangement had inverted our relationship's power dynamics. David made the financial decisions because his business generated the growth potential. David chose our social commitments because his networking needs took priority over my personal friendships. David determined how we spent our free time because his work schedule was less predictable than mine. Gradually, systematically, I had become the supporting character in my own life, the reliable foundation that enabled someone else's dreams to flourish. The changes in David himself were harder to pinpoint but impossible to ignore once I started paying attention. Success had a way of amplifying personality traits that had once seemed charming but now felt increasingly problematic. His confidence had evolved into arrogance, his ambition into entitlement, his charisma into manipulation. He started speaking differently, using business jargon and industry terminology that made simple conversations feel like strategic planning sessions. He bought expensive clothes and a luxury watch, justifying these purchases as necessary investments in his professional image while I continued shopping at Target and driving my reliable but aging Honda Civic. The introduction of Vanessa Cole into David's business marked the beginning of the end, though I didn't recognize it at the time. She appeared at one of David's networking events, looking like she'd stepped out of a luxury real estate magazine, all platinum blonde hair and designer clothing, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. Her divorce settlement had left her wealthy enough to invest in real estate ventures, while maintaining a lifestyle that most people could only dream about. David was immediately fascinated by her, not just professionally but personally. He started mentioning her constantly, repeating her insights about market trends and investment strategies like she was delivering revelations from on high. Vanessa thinks the luxury market is about to explode. Vanessa says we should focus on commercial properties. Vanessa believes that successful agents need to cultivate a premium brand image. Her name became a regular fixture in our dinner conversations, always preceded by glowing descriptions of her business acumen and market expertise. When David announced that he was bringing Vanessa on as a business partner, I felt a chill of foreboding that I couldn't quite explain. She was bringing substantial investment capital and high-end connections, he explained, relationships that could transform Mitchell & Associates from a small residential firm into a major player in the regional market. The partnership made perfect business sense, he insisted, and anyone who couldn't see the potential was thinking too small. I met Vanessa at the partnership announcement party, held at David's office on a Thursday evening in November. She was everything I'd expected and everything I wasn't. Polished, sophisticated, expensively dressed, and completely comfortable being the center of attention. She moved through the room like she owned it, discussing market analyses and investment strategies with the kind of fluent expertise that made everyone lean in to listen. When David introduced us, she offered me a perfectly manicured hand and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "So you're the wife," she said, her tone suggesting this was a mildly interesting piece of trivia rather than an introduction to an equal. "David's told me so much about your little design business, how nice that you have a creative outlet." "My little design business." The words were carefully chosen to diminish and dismiss, delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that successful women sometimes inflicted on women they perceived as less accomplished. I wanted to correct her, to explain that I was a professional marketing coordinator with a degree and a client base and skills that David's business had been exploiting for years. Instead, I smiled politely and thanked her for the partnership that would help David achieve his dreams. Vanessa's influence on David was immediate and dramatic. Within weeks of their partnership being formalized, he started dressing differently, talking differently, carrying himself with a new kind of aggressive confidence that felt foreign and unsettling. He began referring to their properties as our portfolio and their clients as our demographic, using language that suggested an intimacy and shared vision that had taken David and me years to develop, if we'd ever developed it at all. The changes extended beyond professional matters into personal ones. David started criticizing aspects of our life that had never bothered him before. Our house was too modest for someone of his growing stature in the real estate community. Our furniture was too casual for the kind of entertaining he needed to do. My wardrobe was too conservative for the sophisticated image he was cultivating. These criticisms were always delivered as helpful suggestions, framed as concerns for our mutual success rather than personal attacks, but their cumulative effect was to make me feel inadequate in ways I'd never experienced before. The most painful changes involved how David spoke about our relationship in public settings. At industry events and social gatherings, I went from being my wife Sarah, who designed all our marketing materials, to my wife Sarah, to eventually just existing in the background, while David networked and built relationships that apparently didn't require my participation. Vanessa, meanwhile, was introduced as his business partner, his strategic advisor, his collaborator in building something revolutionary in the local real estate market. I started to feel like a burden at these events, a necessary accessory that David tolerated rather than celebrated. Conversations would stop when I approached groups where David was talking business. Spouses of other real estate agents would include me in discussions about vacation plans and home renovation projects, the kind of domestic topics that felt increasingly trivial compared to the high-stakes business strategies being discussed by the actual professionals. I began declining invitations to these gatherings, claiming work commitments or social obligations that didn't actually exist, preferring the honesty of isolation to the humiliation of being ignored in plain sight. The breaking point came during a holiday party at the office of one of David's major clients, a successful commercial developer who threw an annual celebration for his favorite business partners. It was supposed to be a celebration of David's most successful year yet, a chance to showcase the growth and sophistication of Mitchell and Associates under his and Vanessa's leadership. I'd spent weeks preparing for the event, getting my hair done professionally and buying a new dress that I hoped would help me fit in with the kind of polished women who moved in these circles. The party was everything I'd expected and dreaded. Elegant, expensive, and filled with people who all seemed to know exactly why they belonged there. David and Vanessa worked the room together like a choreographed dance, moving from group to group with the kind of effortless teamwork that comes from spending countless hours planning and strategizing together. I tagged along awkwardly, smiling politely during conversations about market trends and investment opportunities that I understood intellectually but had never been invited to participate in professionally. The moment that crystallized everything happened near the end of the evening, when our host raised a toast to the successful partnerships that had made the year so profitable. He specifically thanked David and Vanessa for their innovative approach to luxury property marketing, praising their collaborative vision and strategic expertise. The applause was enthusiastic, and I clapped along with everyone else, proud of David's success even as I felt increasingly invisible beside him. Then David stood to respond, his confidence gleaming under the party's elegant lighting. He thanked their host for his continued support and partnership. He praised Vanessa for bringing expertise and connections that had transformed their business capabilities. He acknowledged the other professionals in the room whose collaboration had made their success possible. And then he sat down without mentioning me at all. The omission was so complete, so casually cruel, that I felt physically dizzy for a moment. I looked around the room to see if anyone else had noticed, if anyone found it strange, that David hadn't acknowledged the woman who'd designed every piece of marketing material that had built his reputation, who'd funded his lifestyle while he reinvested his earnings into expansion, who'd sacrificed her own professional development to support his dreams. But everyone was already moving on to the next conversation, the next networking opportunity, the next strategic connection that might prove useful in the future. I excused myself to the bathroom and spent 10 minutes staring at my reflection in the mirror, trying to understand how I'd become someone whose contributions were so easily forgotten. When I returned to the party, David was deep in conversation with Vanessa and a potential client, their heads bent together over what looked like property photographs on someone's phone. I stood at the edge of their circle for several minutes, waiting for an acknowledgement or an invitation to join the discussion. But they were completely absorbed in their work. Finally, I approached David and quietly mentioned that I was feeling tired and would like to go home soon. He looked up with the vague irritation of someone being interrupted during important business, then glanced at his watch and frowned. "Already? We just got here. Can't you get an Uber or something?" Vanessa and I are in the middle of discussing a potential flip property with Marcus, and this could be huge for us. The suggestion that I should take an Uber home from a party we'd attended as a couple, while he continued networking with his business partner, was so casually dismissive that I felt something fundamental break inside my chest. I nodded and smiled and collected my coat, making polite excuses to anyone who noticed my early departure. During the 20-minute Uber ride home, I sat in the back seat of a stranger's car and finally admitted to myself what I'd been avoiding for months. My marriage had become a business arrangement in which I provided financial support and administrative services in exchange for the privilege of being ignored. The financial analysis came later that night, after David had returned home flushed with excitement about the potential property deal he and Vanessa were pursuing. While he showered off the evening's success, I sat at our kitchen table with a calculator and our bank statements, adding up the true cost of supporting his dreams. The numbers were staggering and depressing in equal measure. Over the past 4 years, I'd contributed approximately $40,000 more to our household expenses than David had. I'd provided an estimated 800 hours of unpaid marketing and design work that would have cost him at least $30,000 if he'd hired a professional firm. I'd turned down freelance opportunities worth roughly $15,000 because I didn't have time to take on additional clients while managing David's constantly evolving needs. The total value of my subsidies and sacrifices was approaching 6 figures, all invested in a business where I had no ownership stake and apparently no recognition. Meanwhile, David's personal spending had increased dramatically as his income grew. Expensive dinners, luxury clothing, premium golf club memberships, the latest technology gadgets. He justified these purchases as business investments or rewards for his hard work, but they represented money that could have been contributed to our shared financial goals, or used to hire the professional services that would have freed up my time and energy. The most painful realization was how completely I'd been erased from the narrative of David's success. At parties and networking events, he spoke about building his business as if it had been a solo endeavor, a triumph of individual vision and determination. The financial foundation I'd provided, the marketing materials I'd created, the social sacrifices I'd made to support his networking schedule, all of it had been absorbed into his personal mythology without acknowledgement or appreciation. I thought about Vanessa's dismissive comment about my little design business, and realized she wasn't wrong exactly. My design work had become little because I'd allowed it to become an extension of David's ambitions, rather than an expression of my own capabilities. My business relationships had withered because I'd prioritized his networking needs over my own professional development. My creative portfolio had stagnated because I'd been too busy serving his vision to cultivate my own. The Honda Civic had been my attempt to reclaim something for myself, to make a financial decision that served my interests rather than our collective goals. Buying it with Grandma Rose's inheritance money had felt like honoring her legacy of independence while asserting my right to exist as an individual within our marriage. For 3 years, that car had been my sanctuary, the one space where I could be alone with my thoughts and my music and my dreams. And David had sold it to fund a business venture with Vanessa, without consultation or consent, as if my feelings about the transaction were irrelevant to the decision-making process. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking, but what hurt most was the assumption behind it, that I was so thoroughly owned, so completely absorbed into his agenda, that my possessions were his to dispose of as he saw fit. The anger, when it finally came, was clean and bright, and clarifying. I wasn't angry at David for being ambitious or successful, or for wanting to build something significant with his career. I was angry at him for using my love as a weapon against my autonomy, for exploiting my willingness to sacrifice as a substitute for genuine partnership. I was angry at myself for allowing the erosion to happen so gradually that I'd confused it with compromise. for mistaking financial support for love and administrative assistance for marriage. But mostly, I was angry at the waste of it all. The waste of my talents and energy and financial resources on someone who'd learned to take them for granted. The waste of years I could have spent building my own career, nurturing my own friendships, pursuing my own dreams. The waste of love and trust and goodwill that David had treated as renewable resources rather than precious gifts that required care and gratitude to maintain. As I sat in Mom's guest room at 3 a.m, listening to her steady breathing and calculating the true cost of my marriage, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: absolute clarity about what needed to happen next. David had sold my car because he'd forgotten that I was a person rather than a resource, an individual rather than an extension of his ambitions. He was about to learn the difference, and the education was going to cost him everything he thought he'd built. Tom Rodriguez answered his phone on the second ring, his voice warm with genuine pleasure at hearing from me. We spent the first 10 minutes catching up on family news and mutual acquaintances from Henderson Marketing, the kind of comfortable conversation that happens between people who'd shared enough difficult moments to trust each other completely. Tom had remarried, he told me, to a wonderful woman named Elena who worked as a school counselor and understood the demands of public service work. His new position with the DMV's fraud investigation unit was challenging but rewarding, he said, especially when he could help people who'd been victimized by predatory dealers or identity thieves. When I finally explained why I was calling, Tom's tone shifted to something more serious and focused. He listened without interruption as I described David's unauthorized sale of my car, asking careful questions about the timeline and documentation that revealed his professional expertise in vehicle fraud cases. By the time I finished explaining the situation, I could practically hear him taking notes. "Sarah, I want to make sure I understand this correctly," Tom said, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who dealt with these situations regularly. "Your husband sold a vehicle that was titled solely in your name, without your knowledge or consent, while you were out of state caring for your injured mother. Is that accurate?" "Yes. The title was in my name only. I bought it with my inheritance money before we were married, and I never added his name to the registration. And he's used the proceeds from this unauthorized sale to make an investment in partnership with someone else?" "That's what he told me. He said he and his business partner needed cash for an investment property, so he sold my car." Tom was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted to something I recognized from his most difficult days at Henderson Marketing: the controlled intensity of someone who'd found a wrong that needed to be righted. "Sarah, what your husband did isn't just morally questionable, it's potentially criminal. In California, selling a vehicle that you don't legally own is considered theft, regardless of marital status. The fact that he's used the proceeds for business purposes rather than personal emergencies makes it even more serious." The words hung between us like a bridge I hadn't expected to find, connecting my personal hurt to legal consequences I hadn't imagined possible. David's casual dismissal of my ownership rights wasn't just emotionally devastating, it was actually illegal. The realization sent a thrill of possibility through my chest, followed immediately by uncertainty about what justice might look like in practical terms. "What would happen if someone reported this?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "Well, that would depend on several factors. The DMV would launch an investigation to verify the unauthorized sale and trace the funds. If the evidence supported the complaint, we'd refer the matter to local law enforcement for potential prosecution. The victim would also have grounds for civil action to recover damages, including the vehicle's value, plus any additional costs incurred." Tom paused, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully. "Of course, these investigations can be quite thorough. We'd need to examine all the documentation surrounding the sale, verify the buyer's good faith purchase, review the seller's financial records to trace the proceeds. Sometimes these investigations reveal additional irregularities that weren't apparent in the original complaint." The implication was clear. If someone looked closely at David's business practices, they might find problems beyond the unauthorized car sale. I thought about his casual dismissal of supplier warnings, his willingness to cut corners when he thought no one was watching, his partnership with Vanessa, funded partly by my stolen inheritance money. A thorough investigation might reveal a pattern of questionable decisions that could threaten more than just his reputation. "How long would something like that take?" I asked. "DMV investigations are typically completed within 60 to 90 days, depending on the complexity of the case, and the cooperation of all parties involved. Of course, if criminal charges are filed, that process can extend considerably longer. 60 to 90 days. Long enough for David's reputation in the real estate community to suffer irreparable damage. Long enough for his partnership with Vanessa to collapse under the weight of legal scrutiny. Long enough for the investment property they'd purchased with my car's proceeds to become a liability rather than an asset. Tom, if someone were to file a complaint like this, would there be any way to keep it confidential initially? Well, the DMV takes these matters very seriously, but we also understand that family situations can be complicated. In cases involving potential domestic issues, we sometimes begin with informal inquiry processes that allow all parties to understand their rights and obligations before formal charges are filed. This can give everyone time to consider their options and explore resolution possibilities. Translation: I could trigger an investigation that would put David's entire business under scrutiny while maintaining the appearance of simply seeking information about my rights. The investigation itself would be punishment enough, regardless of whether formal charges were eventually filed. I think I'd like to understand my options better, I said finally. Would it be possible to file an initial inquiry, just to get the facts documented? Absolutely. I can email you the appropriate forms today, and you can submit them at your convenience. The initial documentation process is quite straightforward, and I'd be happy to ensure your paperwork is properly completed and expedited. After I hung up, I sat in Mom's kitchen with a cup of coffee and Tom's business card, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. The anticipation of consequences finally catching up with someone who'd learned to believe he was untouchable. David had sold my car because he'd forgotten that actions have repercussions, that other people's rights matter, that marriage isn't a license for theft. He was about to receive a comprehensive education in responsibility, delivered by the very system he'd assumed would never challenge his authority. And the most beautiful part was that he'd have no one to blame but himself. No way to claim victimhood or conspiracy when the consequences of his own choices finally came due. I picked up my phone and started drafting the email to Tom, beginning the process that would transform David from a successful real estate agent into someone whose business practices were under active investigation by the state of California. The woman who would have worried about being vindictive or unfair had died the moment David sold my grandmother's car. The woman who remained believed deeply in justice, consequences, and the importance of teaching arrogant men that other people's property rights actually matter. Mom appeared in the kitchen doorway as I was finishing the email, moving slowly with her walker but determined to check on me. She took one look at my face and smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd raised a daughter strong enough to fight back when fighting back became necessary. "How's Tom doing?" she asked, her tone carefully casual. "He's doing very well, Mom. Very well indeed." The DMV complaint forms arrived in my email within an hour of my conversation with Tom, accompanied by a detailed cover letter explaining the investigation process and my rights as a vehicle owner. Reading through the documentation felt like studying a blueprint for justice, each section outlining how the state of California protected citizens from exactly the kind of theft David had committed so casually. The forms were straightforward but comprehensive, requiring detailed information about the vehicle, the circumstances of its unauthorized sale, and any documentation I could provide to support my claim. I spent the rest of Thursday afternoon gathering evidence, surprised by how much documentation I'd accumulated without realizing its potential importance. The original purchase receipt from the Honda dealership, showing my name as the sole buyer and the cashier's check drawn from my personal account. The vehicle registration and title documents, both listing me as the exclusive owner. Insurance records showing my responsibility for all payments and coverage decisions. Bank statements demonstrating that I'd never received any proceeds from the alleged sale. Even photographs of me with the car on the day I'd bought it, looking proud and independent in ways that now seemed prophetic. The most damaging piece of evidence was David's own text message, that casual announcement of theft delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never expected to face consequences. "Sold the Civic today, got a great price, will explain when you get back." 11 words that constituted a written confession to a crime he'd apparently never considered illegal. I screenshot the message and saved it to 3 different cloud storage accounts, understanding instinctively that David would eventually realize the magnitude of his mistake and attempt to destroy any evidence of his confession. Completing the paperwork felt like performing surgery on my own life, carefully documenting each violation and betrayal with the clinical precision required by legal proceedings. The process forced me to confront the full scope of what David had stolen from me, not just financially but emotionally and psychologically. The car had represented my autonomy, my connection to Grandma Rose's legacy of independence, my right to make decisions that served my own interests rather than our collective goals. David hadn't just sold a vehicle, he'd sold the symbol of everything I'd tried to preserve of myself within our marriage. Tom called that evening to walk me through the submission process, his voice carrying the professional competence of someone who'd guided dozens of victims through similar situations. He explained that the DMV would begin with an administrative review of my complaint, verifying the documentation and determining whether the evidence supported opening a formal investigation. If the initial review confirmed unauthorized sale, they'd notify all parties involved and begin interviewing witnesses, examining financial records, and tracing the disposition of the vehicle's proceeds. The investigation would be thorough and methodical, Tom assured me, designed to protect both legitimate vehicle owners and good-faith purchasers who might have unknowingly bought stolen property. David would be contacted within 10 business days and required to provide documentation supporting his authority to sell the vehicle. If he couldn't demonstrate legal ownership or explicit written permission from the titled owner, the investigation would escalate to include potential criminal referrals and civil penalties. The beauty of this process, Tom explained, is that it's completely objective. Either someone has the legal right to sell a vehicle, or they don't. Either they can document that authority or they can't. There's no gray area here. No room for interpretation or excuse-making. The law is very clear about property rights and unauthorized disposal of other people's assets. After submitting the complaint through the DMV's online portal, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. For the first time in years, I'd taken action that prioritized my own interests over David's comfort and convenience. I'd stopped accepting his definition of what mattered and started asserting my own rights as an individual with legal standing and legitimate grievances. The woman who would have worried about being vindictive or causing trouble had been replaced by someone who understood that justice and revenge weren't always different things. I decided to extend my stay with Mom for another week, ostensibly to ensure her recovery was progressing well, but actually to avoid being present when David received notification of the investigation. I wanted to be safely out of reach when he realized that his casual theft had triggered a formal inquiry by state authorities, when he understood that his assumption of immunity from consequences had been catastrophically wrong. The cowardice of avoiding direct confrontation didn't bother me. After 6 years of absorbing his anger and managing his emotions, I'd earned the right to let him process this crisis alone. Mom supported the decision with the enthusiasm of someone who'd spent decades watching her daughter accommodate other people's needs at the expense of her own well-being. She'd never liked David, I realized now, had always seen through his charm to the underlying selfishness that I'd mistaken for ambition. During my extended stay, she shared observations about my marriage that she'd kept to herself for years, gentle but devastating insights that illuminated patterns I'd been too close to recognize. "He never asked about your work," Mom pointed out during one of our evening conversations. "In 6 years of marriage, I never once heard him ask about your projects, your clients, your professional goals. He talked about his business constantly, but your career was treated like a hobby that existed to support his real work." She was right, of course. David's conversational repertoire included detailed discussions of market trends, client strategies, and business development plans. But he'd never shown genuine interest in my professional challenges or creative accomplishments. When I'd landed a particularly prestigious client or completed a project I was proud of, David's responses were always perfunctory, brief acknowledgments before the conversation inevitably returned to his own concerns. "And he never included you in financial planning," Mom continued. "Real partners discuss major decisions together, but David always presented his choices as finished facts rather than opportunities for input. You were funding his dreams while being excluded from the decision-making process that determined how your money was spent." The observation stung because it highlighted the fundamental inequality that had defined our marriage from the beginning. David made unilateral choices about business investments, major purchases, and strategic directions, then expected me to provide financial and logistical support for decisions I'd never been consulted about. My role had been to enable his vision rather than contribute to it. to facilitate his success rather than pursue my own. The DMV notification arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 9 days after I'd submitted my complaint. Tom called to inform me that David had been contacted and required to respond within 14 business days with documentation supporting his authority to sell the vehicle. The official letter would outline the specific allegations and evidence supporting the investigation, giving David an opportunity to provide his side of the story before any formal determinations were made. How did he react when he received the notification? I asked, curious about David's initial response to discovering his actions were under official scrutiny. I can't discuss specific details about ongoing investigations, Tom replied carefully, but I can tell you that people who receive these notifications typically respond in one of two ways. Either they immediately contact legal counsel because they understand the seriousness of the situation, or they call our office trying to explain why the rules shouldn't apply to them. I could easily imagine which category David would fall into. His first instinct would be to charm his way out of trouble, to convince someone in authority that this was all a misunderstanding between a married couple rather than a serious legal matter. He'd probably explain about his business partnership, his investment opportunities, his wife's tendency to overreact about minor issues. The idea that his explanation might not matter, that legal violations carried consequences regardless of his personal circumstances, would take longer to penetrate his consciousness. David's first attempt to contact me came that same evening, a phone call that I let go to voicemail while Mom and I watched an old movie and shared a bottle of wine. His message was exactly what I'd expected, confused, irritated, and vaguely condescending, as if my filing a complaint was an act of inexplicable hostility, rather than a reasonable response to having my property stolen. Sarah, I just got the strangest letter from the DMV about some kind of investigation into your car sale. I have no idea what this is about, but obviously there's been some kind of miscommunication. Can you call me back so we can clear this up? I'm sure it's just a paperwork issue that we can resolve quickly. The casual dismissal of a formal state investigation as a quote, paperwork issue perfectly captured David's assumption that rules existed for other people rather than for him. He genuinely believed that his explanation would make the problem disappear, that his status as a successful businessman would override legal requirements about property ownership and unauthorized sales. The arrogance was breathtaking, but it was also strategically useful. His inability to take the situation seriously would prevent him from mounting an effective defense until it was too late to matter. I didn't return his call. Instead, I sent a brief text message explaining that I was focusing on Mom's recovery and would be unavailable for non-emergency communications until further notice. The message was true but incomplete, omitting my real reason for maintaining distance. I wanted David to navigate this crisis without my emotional labor, without my tendency to smooth over his mistakes and minimize their consequences. His subsequent attempts to reach me escalated in frequency and desperation over the following days. Phone calls, text messages, emails, even a message sent through my Henderson Marketing work account that I deleted without reading. Each failed attempt to contact me would increase his anxiety about the situation, force him to confront the possibility that I wasn't going to rescue him from the consequences of his own actions. The second DMV communication arrived exactly 2 weeks after the first, informing David that his response had been reviewed and found insufficient to close the investigation. Tom called to update me on the status, explaining that David's documentation had failed to demonstrate legal authority to sell the vehicle and had actually raised additional questions about the transaction's legitimacy. What kind of additional questions? I asked, sensing that the investigation was expanding beyond the simple, unauthorized sale. Well, without going into specifics, let's just say that when someone can't provide clear documentation for one transaction, we often examine their other recent activities to establish patterns of behavior. Vehicle fraud rarely happens in isolation. The implications sent a thrill of anticipation through my chest. If investigators started examining David's other business practices, they might discover the pattern of corner cutting and rule bending that had characterized his approach to success. The European caviar situation from the original story flashed through my mind, except in this case it might be real estate transactions that didn't quite comply with disclosure requirements, or partnership agreements that weren't properly documented, or investment schemes that promised returns too good to be legal. The investigation is now moving to its formal phase, Tom continued. Mr. Mitchell will be required to provide comprehensive financial records showing the disposition of the vehicle's proceeds, along with documentation of his business partnership and the investment property purchase. We'll also be interviewing the vehicle's purchaser to verify their understanding of the transaction's legitimacy. The net was tightening around David with the inexorable precision of a system designed to catch exactly this kind of entitled lawbreaking. Each step of the investigation would expose another aspect of his business practices to official scrutiny, create additional opportunities for discovering violations he'd never expected anyone to examine. The man who'd sold my car because he'd never doubted his right to do so was about to learn that authority and entitlement weren't the same thing. David's phone calls became increasingly frantic as the investigation progressed, and his attempts to reach me continued to fail. His voicemail messages evolved from confused irritation to genuine panic as he began to understand that this wasn't a simple misunderstanding that could be resolved with explanation and charm. The investigation was real, thorough, and completely indifferent to his personal circumstances or professional reputation. "Sarah, please call me back. This DMV thing is getting out of hand, and I need to understand what you told them. My lawyer says this could affect my real estate license if it goes any further. We need to talk about this before it ruins everything we've built together. Everything we've built together." The phrase would have been laughable if it weren't so revealing of David's fundamental inability to acknowledge my actual contributions to his success. He built his business using my unpaid labor and financial subsidies, but in his mind it was still something we'd accomplished together rather than something he'd extracted from me. Even facing potential criminal charges, he couldn't admit that his achievements had been built on exploitation rather than partnership. The most satisfying aspect of the investigation was its public nature. DMV inquiries weren't conducted in secrecy. They involved contacting multiple parties, examining business records, and verifying information with banks, dealerships, and other regulatory agencies. David's colleagues and clients would inevitably learn that his business practices were under official scrutiny, that questions had been raised about his integrity and legal compliance. The reputation he'd cultivated so carefully would be damaged regardless of the investigation's final outcome. Vanessa's reaction to the investigation became apparent through the social media posts she stopped making. Her Instagram account, which had been filled with photographs of luxury properties and business success celebrations, went dark for over a week. When she finally resumed posting, the content had shifted to generic motivational quotes and landscape photographs, the kind of safe material people shared when they couldn't risk drawing attention to their actual activities. The silence suggested that she understood the potential implications better than David did. As his business partner, she would be interviewed about their investment activities and required to provide documentation about her own role in purchasing property with proceeds from unauthorized vehicle sales. If she had any sense, she'd be distancing herself from David's legal troubles and reconsidering their partnership arrangement. 3 weeks into the investigation, I received an unexpected call from Maria Santos at Henderson Marketing. She'd heard rumors about some kind of legal issue involving David and wanted to check on my well-being. The conversation was carefully professional, but I could hear genuine concern beneath her supervisory tone. "Sarah, I hope you know that if you need any kind of support during this difficult time, Henderson's Employee Assistance Program includes legal consultation services. And if your personal situation is affecting your ability to focus on work, we can discuss temporary schedule adjustments or leave options." The offer was generous and unexpected, representing the kind of institutional support I'd never thought to seek during my years of enabling David's demands. Maria's call reminded me that I had professional relationships and personal value that existed completely independently of my marriage, that other people recognized my competence and appreciated my contributions in ways David had never learned to do. "Actually, Maria, I've been thinking about expanding my design portfolio and taking on some additional freelance projects. Would Henderson have any objections to me pursuing outside work as long as it doesn't interfere with my responsibilities here?" "Not at all. In fact, I've been hoping you'd consider developing your independent practice. You're incredibly talented, Sarah, and I've always thought you were capable of much more than what your current position allows you to explore." The conversation planted seeds of possibility that had nothing to do with David's legal troubles and everything to do with my own potential for professional growth. While he was discovering the consequences of treating other people's property as his own, I was remembering that I had talents and ambitions that could flourish without his involvement or approval. The formal interview request arrived on a Thursday, requiring David to appear at the DMV office within 10 business days to provide sworn testimony about his role in the unauthorized vehicle sale. The letter explained that failure to comply with the interview requirement could result in additional penalties and potential criminal referrals, making it clear that this wasn't an optional consultation, but a mandatory component of the investigation. Tom called that evening to let me know that David's legal counsel had contacted the DMV requesting a postponement and additional information about the investigation's scope. The request had been denied, he explained, because the evidence was straightforward and the legal requirements were clear. Property owners had rights that couldn't be overridden by marital status or business needs, and unauthorized sales constituted theft, regardless of the perpetrator's relationship to the victim. His lawyer is asking questions that suggest they're beginning to understand the seriousness of the situation, Tom noted. Questions about potential criminal charges, civil penalties, professional licensing implications. This isn't going away with explanations or apologies. The possibility of David losing his real estate license added a dimension to the consequences that I hadn't fully considered. Professional licensing boards took legal violations seriously, particularly when they involved property rights and financial transactions. Even if he avoided criminal prosecution, a formal finding of unauthorized vehicle sale could trigger disciplinary action that would end his career in real estate permanently. I thought about Vanessa's investment and their partnership, her expectation of returns from the property they'd purchased with my car's proceeds. If David lost his license, their business relationship would become worthless overnight, transforming her from a partner in a growing enterprise into an investor in a failed scheme. The woman who dismissed me as someone with a little design business was about to discover that building success on stolen property carried risks she'd never imagined. David's final attempt to contact me before his DMV interview was an email sent at 3 a.m, its timestamp revealing the desperation that had kept him awake while he crafted what amounted to a confession disguised as an apology. The message was long, rambling, and filled with the kind of self-serving justifications I'd heard him use to explain away problems throughout our marriage. He was sorry I was upset about the car, he wrote, but I had to understand that successful people sometimes needed to make quick decisions without lengthy consultation processes. The investment opportunity had been time-sensitive, and he'd been certain I would approve of using the car's value to secure our financial future. He'd planned to surprise me with a better vehicle once the property deal closed and generated the returns he was confident it would produce. The email went on to blame my absence for making communication difficult, suggested that my filing a complaint was an overreaction that could damage both our reputations, and concluded with a request that I contact the DMV to withdraw my allegations before his interview. He still believed, even after weeks of escalating investigation, that I would rescue him from the consequences of his own choices. Instead, I forwarded the email to Tom, understanding that David's written admission of unauthorized sale would eliminate any remaining ambiguity about his culpability. His attempt to manipulate me into withdrawing my complaint had instead provided the final piece of evidence needed to ensure his conviction. The interview took place on a Tuesday morning while I was helping Mom with her physical therapy exercises. Tom called that afternoon to report that David had appeared with legal counsel, but had been unable to provide documentation supporting his authority to sell the vehicle. His lawyer had attempted to argue that marital property laws gave spouses certain rights over each other's assets, but the DMV investigator had explained that vehicle ownership was determined by title documentation rather than marital status. The interview lasted about 90 minutes, Tom explained, and Mr. Mitchell became increasingly agitated as he realized that his explanations weren't changing the legal reality of his situation. His counsel advised him to limit his responses, but he kept trying to justify his actions, instead of simply answering the questions. David's inability to accept that his perspective wasn't legally relevant would have been amusing if it weren't so perfectly characteristic of his approach to rules and boundaries throughout our marriage. He'd spent years believing that his intentions mattered more than his actions, that his success justified methods other people might find questionable. The discovery that legal violations carried consequences regardless of his personal motivations was apparently a shock to his fundamental worldview. The investigation's conclusion came 6 weeks after I'd filed the initial complaint, delivered in the form of an official determination letter that Tom read to me over the phone. The DMV had found clear evidence of unauthorized vehicle sale confirmed that David had no legal right to dispose of property titled exclusively in my name, and determined that his actions constituted theft under California state law. The case was being referred to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution, with civil penalties including full restitution of the vehicle's value, plus administrative costs and legal fees. David's real estate license would be subject to disciplinary review by the state licensing board, with potential sanctions ranging from temporary suspension to permanent revocation depending on the board's findings. The investigation also revealed irregularities in the property purchase funded by the vehicle's proceeds, Tom added. It appears that Mr. Mitchell and his business partner may have violated several disclosure requirements and investment regulations in their rush to close the deal. Those findings are being referred to additional regulatory agencies for further review. The domino effect was beginning, with David's single act of arrogant theft triggering scrutiny of his entire business operation. The man who'd sold my car because he'd never expected to face consequences was about to discover that consequences, once triggered, had a way of multiplying beyond any single violation. His assumption of immunity from oversight had been his greatest vulnerability, leaving him unprepared for the systematic examination that would now expose every corner-cutting decision and questionable practice he'd engaged in over the years. I hung up the phone and sat in Mom's kitchen, feeling something I hadn't experienced since before my marriage: the deep satisfaction of watching justice work exactly as it was supposed to. David had stolen from me because he'd believed that love and marriage gave him ownership over my property and my choices. The law had just taught him the difference between partnership and possession, between authority and entitlement. The woman who'd spent 6 years accepting his definition of what mattered had finally asserted her own rights and discovered that the system designed to protect those rights actually worked when people had the courage to use it. David's education in consequences was just beginning, and I intended to watch every lesson with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally learned to value her own worth over someone else's comfort. Mom found me in the kitchen an hour later, still holding Tom's business card and smiling with quiet satisfaction. She took one look at my face and knew that justice had finally caught up with the man who'd thought he could steal from his own wife without repercussions. "How's David doing?" she asked, her tone carefully innocent. "He's learning some very important lessons about property rights and legal consequences," I replied. "It's going to be quite an education." The first domino fell on a Wednesday morning when David's largest client, Henderson Properties, terminated their exclusive listing agreement via certified mail. I learned about it from Jessica, my college roommate, who'd recently started working as a paralegal for Harrison's legal department. She called me during her lunch break, her voice carefully professional, but tinged with the kind of satisfaction that comes from watching karma finally catch up with someone who deserved it. "Sarah, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but I thought you should know that Henderson just pulled all their listings from David's firm. Apparently, they received some kind of notification from the state about pending legal issues, and their policy is to avoid any association with agents under regulatory investigation. Henderson Properties managed a portfolio worth over $50 million, representing nearly 40% of David's annual commission income. Losing them wasn't just a financial blow. It was a public declaration that the most prestigious property management company in Riverside no longer considered Mitchell & Associates a reliable business partner. In the insular world of high-end real estate, that kind of rejection would spread through the professional community faster than wildfire. How did David react when he found out?" I asked, genuinely curious about his response to this first major consequence of his legal troubles. "Well, according to the office gossip, he showed up here this morning demanding to speak with Mr. Henderson directly. Security had to escort him out when he started yelling about how this was all a misunderstanding that would be cleared up within days. Apparently, he seemed genuinely shocked that they wouldn't wait for his legal issues to resolve themselves." David's inability to understand that business relationships were built on trust and perception rather than legal technicalities was perfectly characteristic of his approach to professional challenges throughout our marriage. He'd always believed that his charm and explanations could overcome any obstacle, that his version of events would automatically be accepted by anyone who mattered. The discovery that a formal investigation carried reputational consequences regardless of its eventual outcome was apparently a devastating surprise. The exodus accelerated over the following days as news of the DMV investigation spread through Riverside's real estate community. Professional gossip networks were remarkably efficient at transmitting information about legal troubles, particularly when they involved successful agents who'd cultivated envious competitors eager to see them fall. David's phone calls went unreturned, his emails were answered with cold professionalism, and his invitations to networking events suddenly stopped arriving. The most damaging blow came from an unexpected source. Marcus Rodriguez, the respected commercial real estate broker who'd helped David break into luxury property sales 3 years earlier. Marcus had been something of a mentor to David, providing introductions to high-net-worth clients and guidance about navigating the complex world of commercial transactions. His support had been instrumental in establishing David's reputation among serious investors and property developers. Marcus withdrew that support with surgical precision, sending a brief email that copied the entire Riverside Real Estate Association membership list. The message was professionally worded but devastating in its implications, announcing that Rodriguez Commercial Properties would no longer maintain referral relationships with Mitchell & Associates due to recently disclosed legal and regulatory concerns that conflict with our firm's commitment to ethical business practices. The public nature of Marcus's rejection transformed David's legal troubles from private embarrassment into industry-wide scandal. Every serious real estate professional in the region now knew that David was under investigation, that his business practices had been called into question, and that established players were distancing themselves from his firm. In a business built on relationships and reputation, the collective shunning was more damaging than any formal punishment the state might eventually impose. Vanessa's response to the crisis revealed exactly the kind of person I'd suspected her of being from our first meeting. Rather than standing by her business partner during his legal difficulties, she began systematically extracting herself from their joint ventures, with the ruthless efficiency of someone who'd learned to protect her own interests above all else. The process started with subtle distancing moves that gradually escalated into complete abandonment. Their shared social media presence disappeared first, with Vanessa quietly removing all photographs and references to Mitchell & Associates from her Instagram and LinkedIn accounts. The professional website they'd launched 6 months earlier was updated to remove her name and contact information, leaving David as the sole representative of what had previously been marketed as a dynamic partnership. Even their business cards were reprinted to eliminate any suggestion that Vanessa Cole remained associated with the firm. The investment property that had been purchased with my car's proceeds became the next casualty of their dissolving partnership. According to the real estate gossip network that Jessica kept me informed about, Vanessa was claiming that she'd been misled about the source of David's investment capital and demanding immediate buyout of her stake in the property. Her legal team had apparently discovered that the vehicle sale proceeds were the subject of an ongoing theft investigation, making the entire transaction potentially fraudulent. She's basically claiming she was an innocent victim of David's deception, Jessica explained during one of our weekly check-in calls. Her lawyers are arguing that she relied on his representations about having legitimate capital for the investment, and that she never would have entered into the partnership if she'd known the money came from unauthorized sales of stolen property. The legal maneuvering was brilliant in its cruelty, positioning Vanessa as another victim of David's questionable business practices, rather than a knowing participant in property investment funded by theft. Whether her claims of innocence were genuine or strategic hardly mattered. The effect was to isolate David completely while protecting her own reputation and financial interests. The woman who dismissed me as someone with a little design business was demonstrating exactly the kind of ruthless self-preservation that had made her successful in the first place. David's attempts to salvage the partnership became increasingly desperate as he realized that Vanessa's departure would eliminate both his investment capital and his access to her high-end client network. He called her repeatedly, sent pleading emails about their shared vision and mutual success, even showed up at her home office, trying to convince her that they could weather this crisis together. She responded by obtaining a restraining order that prohibited him from contacting her directly or approaching her business premises. The restraining order became public record, adding another layer of scandal to David's growing reputation for problematic behavior. Potential clients who might have overlooked regulatory investigations or partnership disputes couldn't ignore court orders restricting his ability to conduct normal business relationships. The legal system that was investigating his theft of my car had now also determined that his business partner needed protection from his harassment. The criminal charges were filed on a Thursday morning in October, exactly 3 months after David had sold my car to fund his investment dreams. Tom called to inform me that the district attorney's office had reviewed the DMV investigation and determined that the evidence supported prosecution for grand theft auto, fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. The charges carried potential sentences ranging from probation to several years in state prison, depending on David's criminal history and willingness to accept responsibility for his actions. The money laundering charge relates to his use of stolen property proceeds to purchase investment real estate, Tom explained. When someone uses the proceeds from one crime to commit additional crimes, the penalties become significantly more severe. Your husband's attempts to profit from stolen property have elevated this from simple theft to organized criminal activity. The irony was perfect in its cruel precision. David had sold my car because he'd wanted to demonstrate his business sophistication and investment acumen to Vanessa and their wealthy client base. Instead, he'd triggered a chain of legal consequences that had transformed him from a successful real estate agent into someone facing potential prison time for organized criminal activity. His attempt to impress people had exposed him as exactly the kind of person those same people wanted to avoid. The arraignment was scheduled for the following month, but news of the charges leaked immediately through court records and local media outlets. The Riverside Press Enterprise ran a brief item in their crime blotter section, identifying David by name and describing the charges in language that made his actions sound both petty and predatory. Local real estate agent charged with stealing wife's car to fund business venture. The newspaper coverage was brief but devastating, reducing 6 years of marriage and a decade of business building to a single paragraph that emphasized the most humiliating aspects of David's downfall. Potential clients searching for his name online would now find criminal charges before they found professional credentials, legal troubles, before they found business success stories. His carefully cultivated public image had been replaced by a permanent record of his willingness to steal from his own wife. David's real estate license suspension was announced 2 weeks after the criminal charges were filed, delivered through an official notice from the California Department of Real Estate that cited both the pending criminal case and concerns about his fitness to represent clients in property transactions. The suspension was temporary pending the outcome of his legal proceedings, but licensing board investigations typically moved much slower than criminal cases, meaning he could be out of business for years even if he eventually avoided prison time. The license suspension triggered the final collapse of Mitchell & Associates as a functioning business entity. Without the ability to legally represent clients or collect commissions, David couldn't maintain his office lease, pay his staff, or honor his obligations to existing clients. The business that had taken him 8 years to build disappeared within weeks, leaving behind nothing but unpaid bills and abandoned listing agreements that had to be transferred to other agents. I watched this destruction unfold from the safe distance of Mom's house in Bakersfield, where I'd decided to stay through the end of the year while David's legal troubles played out. Mom's recovery was progressing well, but her need for assistance provided the perfect excuse to avoid returning to Riverside while my husband's world imploded in spectacularly public fashion. Every day brought new evidence that justice was working exactly as it was supposed to, delivering consequences that were proportional to the arrogance and entitlement that had made them inevitable. The house became David's next casualty, though not immediately. The mortgage had been in both our names, but I'd been making all the payments for the past 4 years, while David reinvested his income into business expansion. With his real estate license suspended and his partnership dissolved, he had no source of income to maintain the property taxes, homeowners insurance, and utility bills that kept the house habitable. The man who'd criticized our modest home for being inadequate to his growing status was about to discover what inadequate housing actually looked like. His calls to me became increasingly frantic as the financial reality of his situation penetrated his consciousness. The voicemail messages evolved from angry demands for explanation to desperate pleas for assistance, each one revealing new depths of financial crisis and social isolation. His legal defense was costing thousands of dollars per month. His business debts were coming due without any source of income to service them. His professional network had abandoned him completely, leaving him without the referrals and recommendations that had sustained his career. "Sarah, Please call me back. I know you're angry about the car thing, but we can work that out after I get through this legal mess. Right now I need your help with the mortgage payment. And maybe you could talk to your supervisor about getting me some freelance design work until my license gets reinstated. I promise things will be different once this is all behind us. The car thing. 3 months after being charged with grand theft auto, conspiracy, and money laundering, David was still characterizing his crimes as a minor disagreement that could be resolved through better communication. His inability to acknowledge the gravity of his actions or accept responsibility for their consequences suggested that prison time might be the only education powerful enough to penetrate his fundamental delusions about accountability and consequences. I didn't return his calls, but I did contact a divorce attorney. The legal advice was straightforward and encouraging. David's criminal actions had violated the fundamental trust required for marriage, and his use of stolen property proceeds for business investments constituted financial abuse that would be considered in any divorce settlement. I could file for dissolution immediately and seek both the return of my car's value and compensation for the unpaid labor I'd provided to his business over the years. The divorce papers were served on David at the courthouse following one of his pre-trial hearings, delivered by a process server who'd been instructed to wait until he was surrounded by other defendants, lawyers, and court officials. The public nature of the service was intentionally humiliating, ensuring that everyone present understood that his legal troubles extended beyond criminal charges into the dissolution of his marriage. According to Jessica, who'd heard about the incident from colleagues who worked in family court, David's reaction was exactly what I'd expected: shocked disbelief, followed by angry protests that this was all a misunderstanding that could be resolved if people would just listen to his side of the story. He apparently tried to explain to the process server, the court clerk, and anyone else who would listen that his wife was overreacting to a minor business decision, that the divorce was just another symptom of the malicious prosecution he was facing. The divorce filing became public record within days, adding another layer of scandal to David's growing collection of legal troubles. Local gossip networks were particularly fascinated by the details included in my petition, which outlined years of financial exploitation and culminated in the theft that had triggered his criminal charges. The story of a successful real estate agent who'd stolen his wife's car to fund a business venture was exactly the kind of scandalous narrative that small-town gossip thrived on. Vanessa's complete abandonment of David became apparent through her social media presence, which resumed its previous glamorous tone after weeks of cautious silence. She began posting photographs of herself at industry events and luxury properties, carefully curated to demonstrate that her reputation had survived its association with David's legal troubles. New partnership announcements appeared on her LinkedIn profile, showing her alignment with established firms that had never been tainted by criminal investigations. The message was clear to anyone paying attention. Vanessa Cole had moved on to bigger and better opportunities, leaving David to face the consequences of his actions alone. The woman who'd encouraged his worst instincts and benefited from his willingness to exploit his wife's labor and resources, had extracted herself from his downfall with surgical precision, emerging unscathed while he faced potential prison time. The investment property that had been purchased with my car's proceeds became the subject of a complex legal battle involving multiple parties with competing claims. The district attorney's office was seeking forfeiture of the property as proceeds from criminal activity. Vanessa was claiming ownership based on her capital contribution and demanding immediate buyout. The original seller was threatening to rescind the transaction due to fraudulent financing. I was asserting rights to compensation based on the stolen vehicle proceeds used for the down payment. The legal complexity was mind-boggling, involving criminal law, real estate regulations, partnership agreements, and victim restitution rights. David's simple plan to impress his business partner with quick access to investment capital had created a legal nightmare that would take years to resolve and cost more in legal fees than the property was worth. His attempt to shortcut the normal processes of business development had instead created the kind of complicated litigation that would follow him for decades. The most satisfying aspect of David's downfall was its public nature and the way it revealed his true character to people who'd previously been impressed by his success. Colleagues who'd envied his rapid rise and luxurious lifestyle now understood that his achievements had been built on exploitation and theft. Clients who'd trusted him with their most valuable assets discovered that he was willing to steal from his own wife, to fund his business ambitions. The professional community that had welcomed him as a rising star now treated him as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and ethical corners. The trial date was set for January, giving David's legal team several months to prepare a defense that seemed increasingly hopeless as additional evidence emerged during the discovery process. The prosecution had my original complaint, David's own text message confessing to the unauthorized sale, financial records showing the disposition of the stolen proceeds, and testimony from multiple witnesses about his business practices and character. His lawyers were apparently advising him to consider a plea agreement that would involve accepting responsibility for his crimes in exchange for reduced sentencing. But David remained convinced that he could explain his way out of consequences, that a jury would understand his perspective and recognize that his intentions had been honorable, even if his methods were questionable. His fundamental inability to accept that other people's property rights mattered more than his business needs suggested that he would reject any plea agreement and insist on taking his chances at trial. The prospect of David representing himself as a victim of misunderstanding and malicious prosecution was almost too delicious to contemplate. I imagined him taking the witness stand to explain how stealing his wife's car had been a reasonable business decision, how his investment strategy justified violating her property rights, how the entire criminal justice system was overreacting to what should have been handled as a private marital disagreement. His testimony would be the final act in a legal education that had already cost him his business, his marriage, his professional reputation, and his freedom. The man who'd sold my car because he'd never expected to face consequences was about to discover that consequences, once triggered, had a momentum all their own. I spent Christmas Day with Mom in the house where I'd grown up, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: the deep satisfaction of watching justice work exactly as it was designed to. The woman who'd spent 6 years enabling David's worst impulses, while sacrificing her own interests, had finally learned to value herself enough to demand accountability. The system designed to protect property rights and punish theft had functioned perfectly, delivering consequences that were proportional to the crimes and indifferent to the perpetrator's status or explanations. David was facing trial, imprisonment, financial ruin, and social disgrace because he'd believed that marriage gave him ownership over my possessions and my choices. The law had taught him the difference between partnership and possession, between authority and entitlement, between success and theft. His education in consequences was nearly complete, and I intended to watch every remaining lesson with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally learned that justice and revenge weren't always different things. The Honda Civic was never recovered, having been sold to an innocent third party who couldn't be forced to return property they'd purchased in good faith. But David would be paying for that car for years to come, through restitution payments, legal fees, and the lost income from the career he'd destroyed through his own arrogance. The $18,000 he'd stolen had cost him everything he'd thought he'd built, transforming him from a successful businessman into a cautionary tale about the price of treating other people's rights as optional. Mom found me in the kitchen that evening, sitting at the same table where I'd filled out the DMV complaint forms that had started David's spectacular downfall. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat across from me, her face reflecting the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd watched her daughter finally learn to fight back. "Any regrets?" she asked gently. I thought about the question seriously, considering the magnitude of destruction that had followed my decision to file that initial complaint. David's life had been completely ruined, his dreams shattered, his future transformed from promising to desperate. A different woman might have felt guilty about the scope of consequences that had emerged from such a simple assertion of property rights. "None at all," I said finally. "He earned every bit of this. And he had. Every criminal charge, every business failure, every public humiliation, every legal fee that would drain his resources for years to come. David had earned it all, through 6 years of exploitation, disguised as marriage, through the gradual theft of my autonomy and identity, through the final arrogant act of selling my grandmother's car to fund his business ambitions. The woman who would have worried about being vindictive or unfair had died the moment David sent that casual text message about selling my car. The woman who remained understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them experience the full consequences of their choices, even when those consequences involve criminal conviction and social disgrace. Justice had been served with the precision and thoroughness that only the legal system could provide, delivering consequences that were proportional to the crimes and indifferent to the perpetrator's personal circumstances. David's education in accountability was nearly complete, and I couldn't wait to see what his final grades would be. The phone call came on a crisp October morning exactly 18 months after David's conviction, delivered by his parole officer with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who handled dozens of similar notifications each week. David Mitchell had been released from state prison and was now residing in a halfway house in downtown Riverside, required to report weekly, and prohibited from leaving the county without permission. The officer was calling to inform me of his release as a courtesy, given that I'd been listed as the primary victim in his case. I thanked the officer politely and hung up, feeling absolutely nothing. No anxiety about potential contact, no curiosity about his current circumstances, no residual anger about past betrayals. The woman who had once defined herself in relation to David's moods and needs had become someone for whom his existence was simply irrelevant. He was a chapter in my life that had been closed, edited, and filed away in the category of mistakes that had ultimately led to better outcomes. My design consultancy had grown beyond anything I'd imagined possible during those dark months when David's legal troubles were unfolding. What had started as a desperate attempt to rebuild my professional identity had evolved into a thriving business with 12 employees and clients across 3 states. The converted warehouse space that housed our offices buzzed with creative energy and collaborative spirit, everything David's sterile real estate office had never been. The success felt earned in ways that David's achievements never had. Built through my own competence and vision rather than extracted from someone else's sacrifice. Every client contract represented work I'd chosen to pursue because it aligned with my values and challenged my abilities. Every employee was someone I'd hired because their talents complemented our team's capabilities, not because they were willing to work for below-market wages while supporting someone else's dreams. Maya Chen, my lead designer and eventual business partner, had joined the firm 8 months earlier, after leaving a toxic workplace where her contributions had been consistently overlooked and undercompensated. Her story was depressingly familiar: brilliant creative work attributed to male colleagues, ideas dismissed until presented by someone with more perceived authority, talent wasted on projects that served other people's visions rather than her own potential. Working with Maya had reminded me why I'd been drawn to design in the first place: the pure satisfaction of solving visual problems and creating communications that actually connected with their intended audiences. Our collaboration had produced some of the most innovative work in my portfolio, campaigns that had won regional awards and attracted national attention from larger agencies trying to poach our talent. The Phoenix Collective had evolved beyond my wildest expectations, spawning chapters in 23 cities and generating enough demand for resources that we'd launched an online platform offering workshops, networking opportunities, and mentorship programs. The women who participated weren't just survivors of bad marriages. They were entrepreneurs, artists, professionals, and activists who shared a common understanding that individual empowerment required community support and mutual encouragement. Dr. Patricia Williams had become our unofficial research partner, documenting the psychological and economic outcomes for women who participated in our programs. Her preliminary findings suggested that women who engaged with supportive communities while rebuilding their independence showed significantly better long-term outcomes in both mental health and financial stability, compared to those who attempted transformation in isolation. The book had been published 6 months earlier, becoming what my literary agent described as a, quote, sleeper hit that gained momentum through word-of-mouth recommendations rather than massive marketing campaigns. Reclaiming Your Worth, A Guide to Independence After Exploitation, had spent 8 weeks on regional bestseller lists and generated speaking opportunities at conferences focused on women's empowerment and financial literacy. The most rewarding responses came from readers who wrote to share their own stories of transformation. Women who'd recognized aspects of their own experiences in my account of gradual diminishment and sudden awakening. Their letters revealed how common my experience had been, how many intelligent and capable women had found themselves slowly erased by relationships that demanded everything while offering nothing in return. Elena Rodriguez had become more than a Phoenix Collective member. She'd become one of my closest friends, and eventually my travel companion for the European vacation I'd finally taken. 3 weeks in France and Italy, staying in small hotels and eating at local restaurants, exploring museums and countryside with the freedom that comes from answering only to your own curiosity and preferences. The trip had been revelatory in ways beyond the obvious pleasure of beautiful landscapes and cultural immersion. For the first time in my adult life, I'd spent extended time making decisions based purely on what interested me moment to moment. No consideration of someone else's schedule, no accommodation of different preferences, no compromise between conflicting agendas. Just the daily luxury of choosing museums or cafes or walking routes based on my own inclinations. Mom had moved to Riverside 6 months after my return from Europe, settling into a comfortable apartment within walking distance of my townhouse. Her physical recovery had been complete, but more importantly, she'd discovered a new sense of purpose through her volunteer work with women's organizations. Watching her daughter rebuild from betrayal had apparently reminded her of her own strength and resilience during the difficult years after Dad's abandonment. Our weekly dinners had become the anchor of my social calendar, conversations that ranged from business strategy to personal philosophy to observations about the complexities of modern relationships. Mom had developed strong opinions about the men I occasionally dated, applying standards of respect and reciprocity that were both protective and perceptive. Not that I was actively seeking serious romantic relationships. The freedom to make decisions based purely on my own preferences and priorities was too precious to compromise with someone else's agenda, at least until I found someone whose presence enhanced rather than constrained my autonomy. The lessons learned from David's exploitation had created clear boundaries about what I would and wouldn't accept in future partnerships. Tom Rodriguez had provided periodic updates about David's adjustment to post-incarceration life, reports that painted a picture of someone struggling to rebuild from complete social and professional destruction. The halfway house placement had been extended twice due to difficulties finding stable employment. His attempts to reconnect with former colleagues had been uniformly unsuccessful. Even basic apartment rentals were challenging due to his criminal record and damaged credit. The man who had once criticized our modest home for being inadequate to his growing status was now grateful for shared accommodations in transitional housing. The person who had dismissed my career as a little design business was applying for entry-level positions at retail stores and fast food restaurants. The ambitious real estate agent who had stolen his wife's car to impress his business partner was discovering what actual struggle looked like when stripped of the financial foundation someone else had provided. I felt no satisfaction in his difficulties, no residual anger about past betrayals. David had become simply irrelevant to my life, a cautionary tale about the consequences of mistaking exploitation for partnership. His current circumstances were the natural result of choices he'd made without consideration for anyone else's rights or well-being. Whatever lessons he learned or failed to learn from his experience were entirely his responsibility. The townhouse I'd purchased 2 years earlier had appreciated significantly in value, but more importantly, it had become the first home I'd ever owned that reflected purely my own taste and preferences. Every room contained evidence of my independence and accomplishment. The art I'd collected during travel, the furniture I'd chosen without compromise, the office space designed specifically for my work needs. The garage housed my current vehicle, a certified pre-owned BMW that I'd purchased after landing my largest client contract. The midnight blue paint was an intentional echo of both stolen Civic and replacement Accord, but everything else about the car represented progression rather than nostalgia. It was reliable, sophisticated, equipped with features that reflected my expanding sense of what I deserved and could afford. Driving to client meetings in that BMW felt like a daily affirmation of the distance I'd traveled from the woman who had once subsided her husband's lifestyle while accepting diminishing returns on her own contributions. The financial independence that funded the car payment came from work I'd chosen to pursue, contracts I'd negotiated based on fair market value for my expertise, success that belonged entirely to me. The woman who had once worried about embarrassing her husband at social events was now someone whose story inspired other women to value themselves enough to demand better treatment. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and entirely my own creation. David had stolen my car, but in doing so, he'd forced me to discover strength I never knew I possessed, and worth I'd forgotten I deserved. Justice had been served with the precision that only consequence could provide, teaching lessons about property rights, personal boundaries, and the difference between partnership and exploitation. Some education required complete destruction of old patterns before new possibilities could emerge. David's theft had been the catalyst for my rebirth into someone who would never again accept treatment that diminished her value or potential. The future stretched ahead, filled with opportunities that belonged entirely to me, adventures I would pursue because they excited me rather than because they served someone else's vision of what my life should look like. The Phoenix Collective continued to grow, my business was expanding into new markets, and my personal relationships were built on mutual respect rather than unequal sacrifice. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals become unexpected gifts when they force you to discover who you really are beneath all the accommodations and compromises. David had thought he was clever when he sold my car to fund his business dreams. Instead, he'd given me the motivation to reclaim everything he'd tried to steal: my identity, my autonomy, and my future. The Honda Civic was never coming back, but what replaced it was infinitely more valuable. A life of genuine independence and authentic success, built on the foundation of someone who finally understood her own worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.